A millionaire accidentally discovered a homeless mother and child seriously injured in the middle of a rainy night. He took them home, but they gave him a surprise that left him in great pain. The rain came down in sheets, hammering the pavement with an unforgiving rhythm. The headlights of the Rolls-Royce sliced through the darkness, illuminating the empty road ahead. Nathan Carter sat in the back seat, one hand resting against his temple, his fingers idly tracing the cold metal of his watch. The hum of the engine, the muted patter of rain against the windows, familiar sounds that usually offered a dull sense of comfort, felt heavier tonight. New York had drained him. Endless meetings, tight schedules, and the suffocating presence of men in suits, talking numbers that meant nothing beyond profit margins. He had left it all behind for the quiet seclusion of his estate, nestled deep in the rolling hills outside the city. But as the car wound through the slick, empty roads, the emptiness he had returned to felt colder than before. He exhaled sharply, glancing at his driver, who navigated the storm without hesitation. Nathan appreciated efficiency and silence. The world expected too much. He gave only what was necessary. Then, just beyond the curve in the road, something shifted in the periphery of his vision. A figure, a woman, staggering through the rain. Nathan's brows furrowed. At first, it barely registered against the dark, rain-blurred landscape, a small, hunched silhouette moving unsteadily along the roadside. Then, as the headlights swept closer, he saw her. A woman, soaked to the bone, struggling forward as if each step might be her last. She was holding something close to her chest, something wrapped in fabric. A child. Nathan exhaled sharply, shifting forward. People didn't belong out here, not in this weather. His first instinct was to ignore it. Whatever her story was, it wasn't his problem. But something about the way she moved, the sheer exhaustion in her frame, gave him pause. "Slow down," he ordered. The driver hesitated but obeyed, easing the car to a crawl. Nathan watched as she dragged herself forward, arms wrapped tightly around the bundle in her grasp. Her hair clung to her face, wet and tangled, and even from a distance he could see the bruises, dark patches marring pale skin. She glanced over her shoulder, eyes wide and unfocused, before taking another faltering step. Then her legs buckled. "Stop the car!" Nathan snapped, already pushing open the door. Cold rain hit him like a slap, seeping through his coat, but he ignored it. The woman collapsed onto her knees, her body pitching forward. In an instant, Nathan closed the distance, catching her before she hit the ground. Her breathing was shallow, skin deathly cold beneath his touch. Up close, the bruises were worse, fading ones on her arms, fresh ones along her jaw. The baby in her grasp let out a soft, pitiful cry, but she held on, even unconscious. "Nathan," the driver called from behind him. "Should I call someone?" Nathan's jaw tightened. There was hesitation in the man's voice, an unspoken question hanging between them. Who was she? What trouble was she running from? But none of that mattered right now. "Get the door," he said, adjusting his grip to keep the baby secure between them. The driver hesitated a second longer, then obeyed. Nathan lifted her effortlessly, surprised by how light she was. Too light. She barely stirred as he carried her to the car, her head lolling against his shoulder. The warmth of the interior wrapped around them as the door shut, sealing out the storm. Water dripped from her clothes, pooling onto the leather seats. She was shivering, even unconscious. Nathan leaned back, exhaling. "Drive," he said. The car pulled away, headlights cutting through the darkness. Nathan glanced down at the baby, tiny, fragile, barely more than a few weeks old. Its little face was scrunched up, fists curling weakly. Somehow, despite everything, it had survived. She had kept it safe. His gaze shifted to the woman. Her lips were slightly parted, her breathing shallow. She had fought so hard to get here, wherever here was. A flicker of something unfamiliar twisted in Nathan's chest. He was used to making split-second decisions in boardrooms, dealing with numbers, assets, and investments. But this was something else entirely. He looked out the window, watching the rain blur the outside world. He didn't know who she was, didn't know what kind of life had driven her to collapse in the storm. But one thing was certain. She wasn't going to die tonight. Inside the car, the storm was a distant roar, muffled by the thick glass. The air was heavy, damp with the scent of rain and something else, coppery, faint, but unmistakable. Blood. His driver cleared his throat uneasily. "Sir, I think—" Nathan lifted a hand, silencing him. His eyes traced the bruises staining her skin, deep. What kind of life had driven her to collapse in the rain, battered and broken, with no one to call for help? The driver stole a glance at him through the rearview mirror, his expression uncertain. "Sir, a woman like that, in this city—" He hesitated. "How does that even happen?" Nathan didn't answer. He didn't know, and for the first time in a long while, that unsettled him. The Carter mansion loomed in the distance, familiar but cold, but at least it was warmer than the cold, rain-soaked ground where the woman had been lying. The car stopped in front of the door. The old butler panicked and hurriedly ran to help Nathan support the woman and the child. Like the driver, he was surprised that Nathan brought a strange woman home so late at night. Inside the mansion was eerily quiet, except for the occasional crackle of embers from the grand fireplace. Rain still pounded against the tall windows, streaking down the glass in restless streams. The warmth inside did little to dispel the damp chill clinging to the two figures now occupying the vast space. Nathan stood near the entrance of the sitting room, his coat dripping onto the marble floor. His gaze flickered toward the woman lying on the couch, wrapped in blankets the housekeeper had hurriedly brought. The baby, still tucked in her arms, made a small, restless noise, but did not wake. "Should I fetch the doctor, sir?" the housekeeper asked in a low voice. Nathan hesitated. He had already done more than he usually would for anyone, let alone a stranger. But something about the way she had collapsed, the way she had held on to that child with the last of her strength, made it impossible to ignore. "No," he finally said. "Not yet. Let her rest." The housekeeper nodded and disappeared down the hallway. Nathan exhaled, raking a hand through his damp hair. Why had he stopped the car? Why had he brought them here? His life was one of precision, every detail calculated. There was no place for impulse. Yet here he was, standing in his own home with a stranger and her child, waiting for an explanation that might never come. He turned away, intending to leave, but a sudden rustling made him pause. Grace stirred. Her fingers clenched around the edge of the blanket, her breathing growing sharp and uneven before her eyes flew open. For a moment, she was utterly still, her body wound tight like a trapped animal. Then, as if realizing she wasn't alone, her head snapped toward him. Nathan barely had time to react before she was scrambling back, pressing herself against the couch's armrest. "Stay away," she rasped, her voice raw from exhaustion. Nathan lifted his hands slightly, a quiet gesture of surrender. "No one's going to hurt you." Her eyes darted around the room, taking in the towering ceilings, the heavy drapes, the opulent chandelier casting golden light over dark wood. A place too grand, too unfamiliar. Panic flickered in her expression, but it wasn't the mansion that terrified her. It was him. Her arms tightened around the baby, knuckles white. Nathan resisted the urge to sigh. He wasn't used to people fearing him like this. In the business world, people respected, envied, or despised him, but they never recoiled as though expecting a blow. "You passed out in the rain," he explained, his tone even. "I brought you here so you wouldn't die of exposure." Grace didn't respond, only watched him with wary, unblinking eyes. She was still shivering, though whether from cold or fear, he couldn't tell. "I had a room prepared upstairs," he added after a beat. "You should rest there." She flinched at the suggestion, her fingers gripping the baby tighter. Nathan could see the struggle in her expression, an instinctive distrust clashing against the fact that she was too weak to leave, that she had nowhere to go. She didn't trust him. That much was clear. He took a step back, giving her space. "You can stay down here if you prefer," he said. "There's food in the kitchen. The housekeeper will bring whatever you need." Still, no answer. Her breath was too quick, her posture still too rigid. She was waiting for something. A threat, an order, a sign that kindness came with a price. Nathan wasn't sure why, but the thought of whatever had made her like this unsettled him. He had done his part. She was inside, safe, no longer freezing to death on the road. There was no reason for him to stay. And yet, he hesitated. His eyes flickered to the baby. Small, fragile, impossibly quiet. A faint line formed between his brows. He didn't know much about infants, but something about how unnaturally still the child was sent a prickle of unease through him. "Has he eaten?" he asked. Grace's head jerked up at that, startled. She blinked as if the question had caught her off guard. Nathan nodded toward the bundle in her arms. The baby. When was the last time he had anything? A beat of silence, then shame flickered across her face. I don't know," she admitted, barely above a whisper. Nathan exhaled. It wasn't irritation exactly, but something close. He had no patience for chaos, for people who weren't prepared. But looking at her now, her exhaustion, the bruises darkening her skin, the way she curled protectively around the child even in fear, he realized this wasn't about negligence. It was survival. He turned to the kitchen without another word. A few minutes later, he returned with a bottle of formula the housekeeper had quickly prepared. He held it out. Grace hesitated. It was a test. He could see it in her expression, the wariness, the reluctance to take anything from him. She had learned, somewhere along the way, that kindness was often a trap. But the baby let out a small, distressed whimper, and her resolve cracked. She reached out, snatching the bottle from his grasp. Nathan watched as she adjusted the baby, bringing the nipple of the bottle to his lips with a trembling hand. The child suckled weakly at first, then latched on fully. Relief flooded her face. She didn't thank him. Nathan didn't expect her to. Instead, he stepped back, watching as she whispered something soft to the baby, her voice barely more than a breath. He didn't understand the words, but there was something achingly familiar in the tone, a voice from another life, another time. Nathan's throat tightened unexpectedly. He turned sharply toward the door, forcing the thought away. "Get some rest," he said over his shoulder. "You're safe here." He didn't wait for a response. He didn't expect one. But as he left the room, a part of him knew he would be checking in again. Nathan rose early, long before the sun crept over the horizon, before the house stirred with the quiet routines of the staff. He preferred these hours, silent, uninterrupted. The world outside could wait. But this morning, something was different. He stood at the window of his study, the city skyline faint in the distance beyond the misty hills. The storm had passed, leaving behind a damp chill. Below, the estate sprawled in quiet luxury, but his focus remained on one small corner of it, the room where she slept. Grace and the child, a stranger and her baby, are now occupying a space in his home, in his life. The thought unsettled him. By the time he stepped into the dining room, the housekeeper had already laid out breakfast. He wasn't expecting to see her, not yet, but there she was, small, silent, a shadow curled into itself. Grace sat at the far end of the long mahogany table, a cup of untouched tea before her. The baby, Andy, was asleep in the bassinet beside her. Nathan took in the stiffness of her posture, the way her hands curled protectively in her lap. Even in warmth, even in safety, She remained braced for something unseen. She didn't acknowledge him when he entered. Nathan poured himself coffee and sat across from her, though the space between them remained vast. He had no patience for unnecessary conversation, but silence, in this case, felt heavier than usual. "I assume you're feeling better," he said at last. Her fingers twitched around the teacup. A small nod, nothing more. "And the baby?" "He's fine." A beat. "Thank you." It was barely a whisper, reluctant but genuine. Nathan leaned back in his chair, studying her. The bruises on her face had deepened overnight, staining her skin in dark patches. Exhaustion clung to her like an old coat. He took a sip of coffee. "You never told me your name." She hesitated, her gaze flickering toward him for the first time. There was caution in her eyes, but something else too, something raw, unguarded. "Grace," she said finally, "and my son is Andy." Nathan nodded. "Nathan Carter." Recognition flashed in her expression. She knew the name. Most people did. He waited for the usual shift, the curiosity, the calculation, but it never came. She only looked at him, then back down at her tea, as if his wealth and reputation meant nothing. Interesting. Silence stretched between them again, but this time it wasn't as sharp-edged. Days passed in slow, uneasy rhythms. Grace remained in survival mode, watchful, withdrawn, moving through the house as though she expected to be thrown out at any moment. She ate little and spoke even less. She cleaned up after herself, as if afraid to be seen as a burden. Nathan, for his part, kept his distance. He buried himself in work, retreating to his study for hours at a time, speaking only when necessary. The mansion was vast enough that their paths rarely crossed. That was how he preferred it. Order, structure, no disruptions. And yet, late one night, long after he had settled into bed, a faint sound pulled him from the edges of sleep. A cry. Nathan frowned, turning onto his side. It was muffled but insistent, carrying through the halls with a restless urgency. The baby. He exhaled, staring at the ceiling, willing himself to ignore it. This wasn't his problem. The child had a mother, and he had done more than enough. But the cries didn't stop. With a muttered curse, he threw off the sheets and padded barefoot through the dimly lit corridors. He stopped outside Grace's room, where the door was slightly ajar. Through the gap, he could see her, a small, exhausted figure sitting on the edge of the bed, cradling the wailing infant. She looked frayed. Her arms trembled as she rocked the baby, murmuring something too soft to hear. Her hair was loose, spilling over her shoulders in tangled waves. Shadows clung to the hollow spaces beneath her eyes. Nathan leaned against the doorway, unseen, watching. There was something achingly familiar in the way she held the child, in the desperation laced in every motion. A mother trying, failing, trying again. His chest tightened unexpectedly. He had seen this before. Helen. Years ago, when she had placed her hand over her stomach, smiling, hopeful, before everything had gone wrong, before time had stolen everything from him. Nathan exhaled sharply, forcing the memory back where it belonged. In the room, Grace finally managed to soothe Andy, his cries quieting into small, hiccuped breaths. She pressed a kiss to the baby's forehead, her shoulders slumping in relief. For a moment, she was just a mother. Not a fugitive, not a woman running from something dark. Just a mother holding on to the only thing in her world. Nathan turned away, leaving before she could notice him. Back in his room, sleep didn't come. For the first time in a long time, he felt something shift inside him, something he wasn't sure he was ready to face. Morning light filtered through the towering windows of the mansion, casting long shadows across the polished floors. The storm had passed, leaving behind a crisp chill in the air. In the kitchen, a quiet clatter broke the stillness, the soft rattle of a bottle being prepared. Grace moved cautiously through the vast, unfamiliar space, her bare feet soundless against the polished marble floors. The mansion was unlike anything she had ever known, grand, pristine, and intimidating in its quietness. She felt like an intruder. Every surface gleamed, untouched by time or human presence. The high ceilings and towering windows made everything seem colder, more detached. How could anyone live in a place like this and still feel human? In the kitchen, she hesitated. The sleek steel appliances gleamed under the soft glow of recessed lighting, the countertops free of any clutter. It was spotless, functional, but soulless. She fumbled with the buttons on the stove, frustration tightening her shoulders. Nothing responded the way she expected. There were no simple knobs, no familiar dials, only sleek panels of glass and digital displays blinking at her like unreadable symbols. Behind her, Nathan cleared his throat. Grace stiffened. She hadn't heard him come in. Without a word, he stepped past her, pressing a few buttons. The stove hummed to life. Grace swallowed, embarrassment heating her face. She hated how helpless she must have looked. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Nathan nodded, a curt, perfunctory motion, devoid of warmth or acknowledgement. Just a reaction, not a conversation. She turned back to the bottle in her hands, focusing on the task of warming Andy's formula. It gave her something to do, something to keep from feeling like she was drowning in unfamiliarity. Nathan lingered, watching. It wasn't prying exactly, but his gaze held something thoughtful. She could feel the weight of it as she shifted awkwardly, testing the temperature of the milk on the inside of her wrist. "You don't know how to use a stove like this," he observed. Grace hesitated. "No." His eyes flickered to the faded bruises along her arm, then back to the gleaming appliances that were second nature to him. She wasn't used to luxury. That much was obvious. Something in his expression shifted, though he said nothing. Instead, he moved past her, pouring himself a cup of coffee. Grace stiffened, but didn't turn around. She had learned over time that some men spoke softly before they struck. Kindness was often a prelude to cruelty. Still, he had done nothing but keep his distance. And now, standing in his house, making a bottle for her son with her own two hands, something in her shifted. She swallowed. A pause. Then, softer. "Thank you for helping us." Nathan was silent for a long moment. Then, finally, "You needed help." No warmth, no expectation, just a statement, clean and detached. Grace took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "Do you live here alone?" She hadn't meant to ask. The question had slipped out before she could stop it. Nathan froze, just for a fraction of a second. Then, with precise control, he lifted the cup to his lips, took a slow sip, and set it down. The silence stretched. His jaw tightened, small, almost imperceptible, but she noticed. He didn't answer. Grace looked around the kitchen again, at the empty counters and the neatly arranged utensils that seemed untouched. She had spent the past few days trying to disappear into the background, but now she saw it. The absence. The vast emptiness of a house that didn't feel lived in. She thought of the way he had watched her feed Andy in the middle of the night, the way he had stood at the doorway and said nothing, as if the sight of a mother and child unsettled him. Nathan turned away first, as if closing the door on the conversation. Grace didn't push. She understood the weight of silence. The night was deep and quiet, the kind of silence that stretched through the vast halls of the mansion like a held breath. The only sound was the distant hum of the wind against the glass panes. Nathan lay in bed, eyes open, staring at the ceiling. Then it came. A sharp knock, rapid and panicked. Nathan was out of bed before he even realized he was moving. He strode across the room and yanked open the door to find Grace standing there, her face pale with fear, her breath coming in uneven gasps. "It's Andy," she said, her voice trembling. "Something's wrong." Nathan didn't ask questions. He followed her down the hall to the small guest room where she had been staying. The baby lay in his crib, his tiny body feverish and restless. His cries were weak, strained, nothing like the healthy wails from before. Grace hovered over him, eyes darting between Nathan and the child, helplessness plain in her expression. "He's burning up," she whispered. I don't know what to do." Nathan didn't hesitate. "Get your coat. We're taking him to the hospital." The emergency room was cold and bright, a stark contrast to the heavy darkness of the night outside. Grace sat rigidly in the plastic chair, arms wrapped around herself, eyes fixed on the small bundle on the hospital bed. Andy had stopped crying, but his breaths were shallow, his skin clammy. Nathan stood beside her, watching as the doctor examined the child. "You got him here just in time," the doctor finally said. "A bad fever, but we've given him something to bring it down. He should be fine by morning." Grace exhaled sharply, her hands trembling in her lap. Relief crashed over her so suddenly that she felt dizzy. Nathan watched her, something unreadable flickering across his face. He had seen people crumble under pressure before, but this was different. It was personal. "You did the right thing coming here," he said, voice low. Grace blinked at him, surprised by the reassurance. Her lips parted, as if she wanted to say something, but instead, she just nodded. The house had its own rhythm. At first, Grace moved through it carefully, as if expecting it to reject her presence. The grand space was a world apart from anything she had ever known. Silent, pristine, untouched by the disorder of everyday life. Too perfect. Too empty. The days passed, slow and uncertain. She remained cautious, her movements deliberate. She cleaned the kitchen after using it and folded blankets neatly after resting on the couch. Not because she was expected to, but because it made her feel less like an intruder, less like she was taking something she had no right to have. Nathan didn't stop her. At first, he barely acknowledged her presence at all. He moved through his home with his usual precision, his time divided between work and silence. A man who lived in luxury, but seemed to take no pleasure in it. But Grace noticed the small things, like how, when she reached for the heavy pantry door with hesitation, he passed by and, without a word, left it slightly ajar for her. Or how, when Andy cried in the night, his footsteps sometimes lingered outside the door before retreating down the hall. It wasn't kindness in the traditional sense. It was restraint, an allowance of space. And for now, that was enough. One morning, as she wiped down the kitchen counter, Nathan walked in, checking his watch. He barely glanced at her as he poured his coffee. "You don't have to do that," he said, voice even. Grace hesitated, cloth in hand. "I know." She set it down. I don't like sitting still." He didn't respond, but something in the way he adjusted his cuff, a brief pause, an unreadable flicker, made her wonder if he understood. The shift was gradual. She had expected to count the days, to track time in measured steps toward an inevitable departure. But instead, she found herself slipping into a new rhythm, one that didn't feel entirely foreign. She still flinched at unexpected noises and still hesitated when he entered the room. But there were moments, rare and fleeting, where she forgot to be afraid. Like when she stepped onto the back terrace one afternoon, drawn by the sound of rustling leaves, and saw Nathan standing by the railing, looking out over the vast stretch of land. He didn't turn when she approached, but something about the way his shoulders settled told her he knew she was there. Or when, one evening, Andy reached for Nathan's sleeve with tiny, clumsy fingers. Nathan froze, coffee cup poised midway to his lips. Grace watched, waiting for him to pull away. But he didn't. He merely looked down at the child gripping the fabric of his suit, brows drawing together in quiet consideration. Andy let out a delighted giggle. Grace's lips parted in surprise. "He likes you," she murmured before she could stop herself. Nathan's gaze flickered to her, unreadable. Then, without a word, he carefully disentangled Andy's fingers from his sleeve, set down his cup, and left the room. But Grace had seen it. The hesitation. Not rejection, not quite. A crack in the armor. And for the first time, she wondered if she wasn't the only one learning how to exist in unfamiliar territory. Nathan returned home late. The weight of the day pressed against his shoulders, the sharp edge of exhaustion dulled only by the quiet hum of the car's engine. Meetings, negotiations, and another city skyline blurring past glass windows. It all blended together. The mansion loomed in the distance as the car approached, its lights a soft golden contrast against the darkened sky. As the driver pulled through the gates, Nathan exhaled slowly, running a hand along his jaw. He had expected silence when he walked inside. Instead, he heard her. Through the open doorway of the sitting room, Grace sat on the couch, rocking Andy in slow, measured movements. A small lamp cast a warm glow over them, flickering as the baby's tiny fingers curled and uncurled against the fabric of her shirt. Nathan paused in the hallway, watching. There was something hypnotic about the way she moved, gentle, instinctive, utterly unlike the woman he had first brought into his home. Then, she had been rigid, trembling, her every breath braced for impact. Now, she simply held the child. Andy stirred, letting out a small, protesting whimper. Grace whispered something soft, her voice barely above a breath. Nathan's chest tightened. He had seen this before. Not her. Someone else. Helen. Memories drifted in uninvited, the way she had once traced absent circles over her stomach, the quiet way she had spoken of a future that had never come to pass. Nathan clenched his jaw and forced himself forward, shoving the thought aside. "You're still awake." His voice was low, even, breaking the stillness. Grace glanced up, surprised but not startled. She blinked, as if pulling herself from another world, then nodded. He wouldn't settle. Nathan's gaze flickered to the child, then back to her. "Fevers do that." She sighed, shifting Andy slightly. "He's better now." Nathan didn't respond. He moved to the side table and poured himself a drink, the amber liquid catching the light as it swirled in the glass. "You don't talk much, do you?" Nathan arched a brow, but didn't look at her. "Neither do you?" Grace swallowed, her hands gripping the fabric of her sleeves. It was strange, this moment, like standing on the edge of something fragile. She hadn't spoken about Chris since she arrived here. Not really. She had spent years swallowing the truth, keeping her voice small, believing that if she stayed quiet enough, maybe, just maybe, she could disappear. But tonight, the words pressed at her ribs, clawing their way out. "He wasn't always like that," she started, her voice barely above a whisper. "At least I don't think he was. Maybe I just wanted to believe that." Nathan's jaw tensed, but he didn't interrupt. Grace exhaled slowly, focusing on the flames flickering in the fireplace. "In the beginning, he was charming," she continued, her tone hollow, detached. "Said all the right things, made all the right promises. I was young and I thought I was lucky." Her lips curled slightly in something that wasn't quite a smile. Turns out, luck had nothing to do with it. Nathan remained silent, but his stillness was different now. It wasn't indifference. It was restraint. Grace's fingers twisted together. It started small. The control. The little rules that didn't seem like much at first. "Don't wear that. Don't talk to him. Don't leave without telling me." She swallowed. "And then one day, I made the mistake of thinking I had a choice, and he made sure I never thought that again." Her voice wavered, but she pushed through it. "I lost 3 pregnancies before Andy," she admitted, her throat tightening. 3. Nathan's head turned slightly, just enough for her to see the sharpness in his profile, the rigid line of his shoulders. She let out a bitter laugh. "But I still stayed, Told myself it would get better, that I could fix it. She finally looked at him then. I was wrong. Nathan's grip on the mantelpiece tightened, his knuckles white. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, finally, he exhaled slowly through his nose, his expression unreadable. Grace studied him carefully. There was something there, a flicker, a shadow beneath the surface. "Do you know what it's like?" she asked quietly. His eyes darkened, but he didn't answer. She tilted her head, observing the way his jaw clenched, the way his shoulders remained impossibly tense. "You do, don't you?" she murmured. Nathan's gaze snapped to hers then, sharp and unguarded for the briefest second. Then, just as quickly, the mask slid back into place. "You should rest," he said instead. Grace knew a deflection when she saw one, but she didn't push, because for the first time, she wasn't sure which of them was the more haunted one. Leave a comment Rice if you're excited to hear the next part of the story. The morning light filtered through the curtains, casting soft patterns across the floor. Grace stood in the small guest room, staring at the half-open closet. Her hands trembled. Nathan's words echoed in her mind. "Get some clothes ready for Andy." He hadn't elaborated. He never did. But the weight of those words settled deep in her chest. This was it. She had known this moment would come, had expected it from the very first night she stepped into this house. She had told herself not to get comfortable, not to mistake kindness for permanence. But somehow she had. Somehow in the quiet gestures, in the space he allowed her, in the way his presence had become a strange sort of anchor, she had begun to want to stay. And now, she was leaving. Grace swallowed, forcing herself to move. She folded Andy's tiny onesies, her fingers brushing the soft fabric with aching care. She had nothing else, no real belongings, no place to go. She had spent years believing she needed no one. But now, standing in this house that had sheltered her, in the presence of a man who had asked for nothing in return, the idea of leaving felt like losing something she didn't know she had. A lump rose in her throat. She blinked hard. She wouldn't cry. This was not her home. Nathan Carter was not hers to rely on. And yet, as she placed the last of Andy's clothes into a small bag, her heart whispered a truth she wasn't ready to admit. She didn't want to go. Nathan sat in his study, sifting through documents, but his attention was elsewhere. He had noticed Grace's presence more than he should. The soft sound of her footsteps down the hallway, the way she hummed to Andy when she thought no one was listening. Then, the knock. Nathan looked up as Grace hesitated in the doorway. "You asked me to get ready." For a moment, he didn't follow. Then he remembered. He had told her to prepare some clothes. Something about the way she stood there, shoulders slightly hunched, gaze wary but oddly resigned, made him pause. She thought he was sending her away. Nathan set his pen down. "Grace." She nodded stiffly, cutting him off. "I understand. You've already done more than enough. I won't make this difficult." Nathan exhaled through his nose, rubbing a hand along his temple. She still expected to be discarded. Instead of explaining, he stood, grabbed the woven basket from the side table, and walked past her toward the door. When she didn't follow, he glanced back. "Are you coming?" Grace blinked. "Coming where?" Nathan raised an eyebrow. "You'll see." The park was nearly empty, save for a few morning joggers and an elderly couple feeding birds by the lake. The air smelled of damp grass and autumn leaves, crisp and clean in a way that softened the edges of reality. Nathan spread the blanket on the grass with practiced ease, setting the picnic basket down. Grace, still caught between confusion and disbelief, sat slowly, holding Andy close. "I thought," she started, then hesitated. Nathan poured a cup of tea, handing it to her without looking. "You thought I was throwing you out." She swallowed, fingers tightening around the cup. "Wasn't I?" His gaze flickered to hers, unreadable. "If I wanted you gone, Grace, you wouldn't still be here." She let out a small, breathless laugh. "That's reassuring." Nathan didn't react, simply turned his attention to Andy, who cooed happily in her arms. The baby's fever had broken, leaving only rosy cheeks and bright, curious eyes. For a while, they ate in silence. Then, without looking up, Nathan said, "You should forget him." Grace stiffened. Nathan watched as her grip on her teacup faltered slightly, knuckles whitening. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. Chris, her past, the ghost she still carried. "You think it's that easy?" she murmured. Nathan tilted his head. "Number. But it's necessary." She looked down at Andy, brushing her fingers gently over his tiny hand. "I want to," she admitted softly, "but I don't know how." Nathan's jaw tightened. He had seen it before, the way people carried their ghosts, let them fester beneath their skin, whispering that they would never be free. Nathan had his own ghosts, but he had never been one to let the past dictate the future. "You start by letting go," he said simply. Grace didn't respond, but something in her expression shifted, a decision, a reckoning. That night, long after Andy had fallen asleep, she sat by the fireplace, staring at the flickering flames. It was late, too late for thinking, too late for regrets. But Grace couldn't sleep. It was late. Too late for thinking, too late for regrets. But Grace couldn't sleep. She sat curled on the couch, Andy nestled against her, his tiny breaths warm against her collarbone. She should have taken him back to the guest room, should have rested herself, but instead, her fingers traced over something cold in her lap. A necklace, the one Chris had given her years ago. It gleamed in the firelight, deceptively beautiful. A delicate silver chain, a single sapphire nestled at its center, elegant, expensive, meaningless. She should have pawned it, sold it for baby formula or a bus ticket out of town. But she hadn't. She had kept it, even after everything, shoving it into the deepest corner of her bag, as if some part of her still clung to the woman who had once believed in the promise it represented. But not anymore. Her fingers tightened around it, her knuckles turning white. She had survived too much to keep a relic of that life. With a deep breath, she stood, intending to throw it into the flames. Nathan stepped into the room, drawn by the glow of the fire. He paused when he saw her, his gaze flickering to the necklace in her palm. His heart stopped. He knew that necklace. It was impossible. But there it was, resting against her skin, the same necklace he had given to Helen. Nathan forced his expression into careful neutrality. "You're getting rid of it?" His voice was calm and measured. Grace nodded, fingers tightening around the chain. "It doesn't belong to me anymore. Chris gave it to me, but now I don't want to see it." Nathan took a slow breath, and then, without hesitation, he reached out. "I'll do it." Grace hesitated, then handed it over. Nathan curled his fingers around the cool metal, concealing it in his palm. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded, said nothing. But that night, long after Grace had gone to bed, he didn't let it go. Instead, he sat alone in his study, staring at the necklace in his hands, the weight of memory pressing against his chest. Impossible. But there it was, the exact necklace he had given Helen. His fingers hovered over it before finally picking it up. The weight was familiar. The delicate chain, the curve of the sapphire. It was identical. His mind raced, unraveling things he hadn't let himself think about in years. Helen had been wearing this the night of the accident. He had searched for it afterward, convinced it had been lost in the wreckage. And now, it had reappeared. With Grace. Nathan clenched his jaw, forcing down the surge of unease curling in his chest. Chris. The name now sat differently in his mind, an itch he couldn't ignore. He had barely given the man much thought beyond what Grace had shared, an abuser, a coward, a ghost of a man she had finally escaped. But now, Nathan needed to know who he really was. His grip tightened around the necklace, the metal biting into his palm. For the first time in years, the past wasn't just a memory anymore. It was reaching for him again. Nathan Carter had never been a man to chase ghosts. The past was dead, buried beneath layers of time and silence. But now, staring at the necklace lying in his palm, Helen's necklace, resting where it shouldn't be, he knew that the past had never truly left. It had been waiting. And its name was Chris. Nathan's grip tightened around the delicate chain, jaw clenching as thoughts raced through his mind. He wasn't a man prone to coincidences. If this necklace had found its way into Grace's hands, there was a reason. He needed answers. By the time morning arrived, Nathan had already made his decision. He sat in his study, his fingers drumming against the desk as the phone rang. A sharp, controlled rhythm. He didn't have to wait long. A gruff voice answered, rough with sleep. "Carter, it's 6 in the damn morning." "Mike," Nathan said evenly, "I need you to look into someone for me." There was a pause, then a sigh. "Is that serious?" Nathan's gaze flickered to the necklace still resting on the desk, then toward the faint sound of Grace's footsteps down the hall. "Yes." "Name?" Nathan exhaled slowly. "Chris Devlin." Another pause. "This one is heavier." "All right," Mike said. "Give me a day." Nathan ended the call and leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. A day. He could wait a day. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Nathan's phone buzzed. Mike's voice was quiet, unreadable. "You're going to want to sit down for this." Nathan didn't. "Go ahead." Mike exhaled. "Devlin's bad news. More than just your standard piece of garbage. The guy's got a history. Fraud, money laundering, illegal gambling operations. But here's where it gets interesting." Nathan's fingers tightened around the phone. "I'm listening." Mike hesitated. 5 years ago, there was an accident, a hit and run. Wealthy woman, mid-30s, pregnant. She died on impact. The driver fled. Nathan's pulse turned to ice. Mike continued. The case went cold. No witnesses, no evidence. But there was one suspect, someone who had motive, history, and a vehicle that matched the damage reports. Nathan's breath was steady, but his grip on the phone was anything but. Mike's voice dropped. "Nathan, it was him." A sharp silence filled the space between them. Chris Devlin. Chris Devlin had killed Helen. Nathan's free hand curled into a fist against the desk, a slow, controlled breath. The past had just become the present, and Nathan wasn't the kind of man to let things go. He didn't sleep that night. Instead, he sat in the dim light of his study, staring at the necklace in his hands. The weight of it felt different now, not just memory, but proof. Proof that the man who had stolen Grace's life was the same man who had taken his. Nathan had spent years burying his grief beneath work, beneath precision, beneath carefully measured control. But now, for the first time in a long time, anger coiled beneath his skin. This wasn't just about Helen anymore. It was about Grace. Chris Devlin wasn't just a name in a file anymore. He was a problem. And Nathan Carter never left problems unsolved. Nathan had never been hesitant before. He was a man who dealt in certainties, in hard facts and sharper truths. But now, standing outside Grace's door, the weight of the truth he carried felt heavier than expected. He had planned on waiting, on figuring out the best way to tell her. But waiting had never served him well before. Chris Devlin had taken too much already. Nathan wasn't about to let him take anything else. He knocked once, firm. No hesitation. Grace opened the door, Andy asleep in her arms. She looked tired, her eyes shadowed, but something else lurked beneath the exhaustion. Uncertainty. The kind that came from expecting bad news. Nathan didn't waste time. "We need to talk." She hesitated, then nodded, stepping aside. The fire in the sitting room was burning low, casting flickering light against the walls. Grace sat stiffly on the couch, Andy nestled against her, while Nathan remained standing, his presence heavy, unyielding. "I had Mike look into Chris," he started, his voice even, controlled. "I needed to know what he really was." Grace swallowed, her fingers tightening around the baby's blanket. "And," Nathan watched her closely, "he's worse than you thought." She let out a breath, shaky but unsurprised. Nathan continued, "Fraud, extortion, illegal gambling. His list of crimes is longer than I expected." He paused. "But that's not all." Grace looked up. Nathan clenched his jaw, then finally said it. "He killed someone." The words dropped like a stone into the room, the air shifting, tightening. Grace went completely still. "He was behind a hit-and-run accident 5 years ago," Nathan pressed on. "The victim was a woman, pregnant." He swallowed. "She died instantly." Grace's breathing hitched. Nathan's grip on the armrest tightened. "That woman was Helen, my old wife." It took a second for the name to register. Then Grace paled. Her lips parted, but no words came. Nathan didn't move, didn't break eye contact. He wanted her to see it, to understand the weight of what he was telling her. Chris Devlin wasn't just her monster. He was Nathan's. Grace shook her head, as if trying to piece together something that didn't fit. Her voice broke. "I didn't know." Nathan exhaled sharply through his nose. "I know." A long silence stretched between them, thick with something unspoken. Then, finally, Grace let out a small, choked laugh, bitter, broken. "I loved him." The words came out like an admission of guilt, soft and raw. "I thought he loved me." Nathan's fists clenched. She looked down at Andy, brushing a shaky hand over his tiny fingers. "I let that man into my life," she whispered. "I trusted him. I carried his child." Her breath hitched. "How could I have been so blind?" Nathan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he moved. Slowly, deliberately, he crossed the space between them and crouched in front of her. Close enough for her to see the steel in his expression, but not close enough to crowd her. "You were surviving," he said simply. Grace met his gaze, something breaking in her. A silence stretched between them. Then Nathan reached out, his fingers grazing her cheek. He barely touched her, just enough to tilt her chin up, forcing her to see him. "You're stronger than you think," he murmured. She looked up, something raw and fierce in her eyes. "What do we do?" Nathan met her gaze. No hesitation. "We set a trap." The plan was simple. Grace would contact Chris, pretending to be desperate. She would tell him she had nowhere else to go, that she wanted to come back. Nathan and Mike would be waiting in the shadows. The police would take care of the rest. It had to be done carefully. Chris was unpredictable, dangerous. If he suspected anything, he wouldn't come alone. Grace hesitated only once, when she held the phone in her hands, staring at Chris's number. Nathan watched her carefully. "You don't have to do this." She swallowed hard, shaking her head. "I do." Her fingers hovered for only a moment before pressing the call button. It rang once, twice. Then, "Grace?" The voice on the other end made her stomach twist. She forced her breath to steady, forced herself to sound small, lost. "Chris, I don't know what to do. I'm scared." A pause. Then a slow, predatory purr. "Baby, I knew you'd come to your senses." Nathan's fists clenched at the sound. Grace swallowed bile. "Can you come get me?" A dark chuckle. "Of course." They met in an abandoned parking lot just outside the city. The air was thick with the scent of rain and oil, the pavement slick beneath the dim streetlights. Chris stepped out of the car, the smirk on his face one she knew too well. the one that promised pain beneath the pretense of affection. But this time, she wasn't afraid. Nathan watched from the shadows, tension locked in his frame. He had thought he would feel rage, fury. But watching Grace stand there, her spine straight, her voice unwavering as she lured Chris in, all he felt was admiration. She was stronger than she realized. Chris moved toward her, reaching for her like she still belonged to him. Then, sirens. Red and blue lights flooded the lot, cutting through the dark. Chris's head snapped up, his body going rigid. "No!" he hissed. He spun toward Grace, eyes wild. "You set me up?" She didn't flinch. Nathan stepped forward, his presence solid, unyielding. Chris barely had time to react before officers tackled him to the ground, pinning his arms behind his back. He thrashed, cursing, spitting threats. His gaze locked onto Grace. "You were always mine," he snarled. For a moment, she was back in that small apartment, back in the cycle of fear, submission, and silence. But not anymore. She stepped closer, her voice steady. "Number I never was." Chris's struggles slowed, and in that moment, Grace saw it, the realization settling in his eyes. She was free. Chris Devlin had lost, and he knew it. The mansion felt different, lighter, warmer. For the first time since Grace had arrived, the weight pressing down on its grand walls had lifted. The ever-present tension, the feeling of something lurking just beyond the shadows, it was gone. Chris was gone. And yet, as she stood in her room, carefully folding the last of Andy's clothes into a small bag, Grace couldn't shake the ache in her chest. She had always known this wasn't her home. It had been a place to hide, not a place to belong. She exhaled slowly, brushing a hand over the soft fabric of the baby's blanket. Andy cooed from his crib, stretching in his sleep, blissfully unaware of what today meant. It was time to leave. The thought settled in her stomach like lead. She should have been relieved. She was relieved. Chris was locked away. The nightmares couldn't reach her anymore. The fear that had once ruled her every breath no longer had power over her. Then why did her hands tremble? A quiet knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. She knew who it was before she turned. Nathan. He didn't step inside. He just stood there, framed in the doorway, watching her with that unreadable expression he always wore. But there was something different in his eyes, something uncertain. "You're leaving." Not a question, a fact. Grace swallowed, nodding. "You've done more than enough. I don't want to impose." Nathan exhaled through his nose, his jaw tightening slightly. "Where will you go?" She hesitated. She hadn't thought that far ahead. For so long, her only goal had been survival. There had never been time to dream of anything else. She forced a small smile. "I'll figure it out." Nathan didn't react, but his silence felt heavy. When she finally turned to face him fully, his expression was unreadable, but his eyes, for the first time, there was something unsteady in them, something that looked almost like fear. Nathan Carter was not a man who feared losing people, because he had never let anyone close enough to be lost. But now, here they were. She shifted slightly, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on her. "Nathan, I want you to stay." The word stopped her cold. She stared at him, her lips parting slightly, her breath catching. Nathan didn't look away. His posture was the same, rigid, composed, but something about the way he stood there waiting felt different. It wasn't obligation, it wasn't pity, it was a choice. "Not because you need to," he said, voice quieter this time, "but because you want to." Her throat tightened. She didn't know how to answer. Nathan wasn't a man who asked for things. He demanded, he took, he built walls around himself so nothing could touch him. But right now he was standing there, asking her to stay. Grace's chest ached with something she couldn't name. She had spent so long running, always waiting for the next storm, the next betrayal. But Nathan had never once pushed her away, never demanded anything from her. He had only ever given her space to choose. And now, he was giving her this. Her fingers clenched at the fabric of Andy's blanket, uncertainty swirling in her chest. I don't know if I can. Nathan exhaled slowly, stepping forward. Not enough to corner her, just enough to close the space between them. You can, he said simply. Her breath hitched. Nathan reached for her hand, slowly, giving her a choice. Grace stared at his fingers, strong but careful, waiting. Then, for the first time, she didn't pull away. Her fingers curled around his. A choice. A beginning. The next morning, Andy's laughter filled the air, echoing softly through the sunlit room. For the first time in years, the past no longer haunted them. And for the first time, Grace wasn't looking for an escape. The morning sun filtered through the large windows, casting golden light onto the polished wooden floors. The mansion felt different now. The heavy silence that once filled its halls had been replaced by something softer, something alive. Nathan stood on the back terrace, a steaming cup of coffee in his hand. The crisp morning air carried the scent of damp earth and fresh rain. He watched the garden below, lost in thought. Behind him, laughter rang through the house. Andy's, Grace's. Nathan wasn't sure when it had happened, when their presence became something he needed rather than something temporary. At first, he had convinced himself that helping Grace and Andy had been an obligation, a matter of morality rather than emotion. But over time, their presence had become more than that. Maybe it was the way Grace unconsciously hummed to Andy when she thought no one was listening, or the way Nathan caught himself waiting to hear her soft footsteps in the hallway, or maybe it was something deeper, something he had long buried. A door creaked open behind him. Nathan turned, expecting hesitation, but Grace stood there with certainty in her eyes. She had chosen to stay. She still didn't belong to him. Not yet, not fully, but she wasn't running anymore, and that was enough. For now. That evening, Nathan did something he had never done before. He brought them to Helen's grave. The cemetery rested on a quiet hill overlooking the city. It was peaceful, the scent of roses and damp earth filling the air. The sky had turned a soft shade of amber as the sun lowered, casting long shadows over the neatly arranged headstones. Helen's grave was simple, elegant, a reflection of the woman she had been. Nathan had come here alone for years, each visit a reminder of what he had lost. But tonight, standing with Grace and Andy beside him, it didn't feel like a place of grief. It felt like closure. Nathan crouched, his fingers tracing along the carved letters of Helen's name. He had loved her once, completely. But love wasn't meant to be frozen in time. It was meant to be lived. He exhaled slowly. Thank you. For what, he wasn't entirely sure. Maybe for the time they had, maybe for letting him go, maybe for leading him here. When he stood, Grace was watching him. She didn't say anything, but there was understanding in her gaze. Nathan reached out, gently adjusting the blanket wrapped around Andy. The baby blinked up at him, then giggled, reaching for his sleeve. Grace smiled softly. He likes you. Nathan smirked. I've noticed. She hesitated, then, voice quieter. So do I. Nathan stilled. She reached for his hand. This time, without hesitation. Nathan's fingers closed around hers, warm and steady, and as they walked back toward the car, together, as a family, the past no longer weighed him down. It had shaped him, yes, but it no longer defined him. And for the first time in a long, long while, Nathan Carter was looking toward the future, with them. If this film touches your heart, leave your mark with a like, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to explore more meaningful stories with us. Share your feelings with us and tell us your own stories. Every word you share is a building block that helps create our strong and enduring community. Together, we'll create a warm space where everyone can share and connect. Finally, don't miss the incredible stories coming your way soon. We're always here to bring you the best selections, full of deep values, yet entertaining. See you there.